Hey everyone, James here. Today going to be reviewing another Italian crime film, a Poliziotteschi. It doesn't fit quite as neatly into that term as some of the other Italian crime films of this era, but I think it's probably the genre that you would lump this in if you had to. And that film has been recently released in the last year or so in the Arrow box set. No, the case is happily resolved from 1973. So, 1973, Italian industry very much towards the kind of like the apex of what it would be. I believe kind of like its sort of like product and like its share of the domestic market and stuff really peaked in like the mid 70s, 1973 to 75-ish. And from there, it really went downhill. So at this point, it's still at a very, very healthy, good place. And this is one of those films that I had seen already. I had already seen all 5 of the films that Arrow picked out for the box set before they released it. But this was one of those that I was surprised to see on the list. And that's not because I don't like it, but it's because it's kind of one of those that tends to be a little bit more unsung. It's one of those that's a little bit headier. For me personally, I tend to classify the Eurocrime genre into a few different buckets. You have like your Fernando De Leo ones that are just very well balanced, and you can see the appeal. There's some social commentary and stuff baked in there. And then there's stuff that's a little bit more of like just like the action-y romps. Sometimes these lean a little bit more heavily into the sleaze, especially as you get further into the 70s. So a lot of stuff done by Umberto Lenzi. Probably my favorite of those films is Almost Human, which I really like. I think that's my favorite of those. But those for me are a little bit hit or miss. I can definitely like a good deal of sleaze and stuff like that, but not every day. And sometimes it's not exactly what I'm in the mood for. And then you have your Damiani camp, which is where I would put this film, which is stuff like Confessions of a Police Captain, The Case is Closed, Forget It, which has actually a fairly similar title to this. I Am Afraid. Those are all Damiani films. He has a bunch more. How to Kill a Judge, I think, is one of his too. The Sergio Slima film Revolver. And these ones tend to be a little bit more character-based. They're not as set-pieced happy, or at least they tend not to be. And they often have strong social messages. A lot of it is about class and stuff like that. And I really like a lot of these films. I think they often are a little bit more unsung because they lacked the sort of like unsavory elements that you're going to get in more of those really, really lurid Eurocrime films that are just like really good hooks to get you into it. So those films would not be the ones starring Maurizio Merli or anything like that. And so I think a film like this really helps to round out that box set and really showcase the diversity of the Eurocrime genre because it is so different from those films. So like when I was buying some of the films from that set, I was really interested in stuff like Colt 38 Special Squad, which is just a really fun, Dirty Harry style film. But it offers kind of like cheaper thrills in a way. And I do really like that film. I enjoy it heavily. But this film, I think there's absolutely a spot for it. And upon rewatching these films, honestly, I think I like this film more than Colt 38 Special Squad. So it's sort of interesting to see on rewatching these films where they sort of end up on your overall kind of like internal rankings. And of course, very, very subjective. But a film like this, as well as Highway Racer, actually went up in my estimations. Whereas something like Colt 38 maybe stayed the same or was knocked down just half a notch or something like that. So still very much films I enjoy. But I do very much appreciate what Arrow did in terms of bringing this film onto it, which is definitely not one that I ever expected to really see a Blu-ray of, too. So, yeah, so that's enough about the start of the film, about sort of the background of the film. So, synopsis: a young man witnesses the killing of a prostitute and to avoid annoyances, does not report the fact. However, the killer saw him and takes advantage of it by accusing him of the crime. So, this one starts off with that, and the author Troy Holworth, who writes a lot on giallo and Italian genre films in general, wrote in kind of like the essay that was included for this film. And he compares it with a giallo, the opening. And I think the opening really is extraordinary. It's probably the best scene in the film. It opens very, very much like a giallo. In 1973, very much the heyday of giallo too, heyday of the Italian film industry. This point is very, very much at the peak. So I do wonder a little bit, because it opens with this great set piece where our protagonist, played by Enzo Caruso, sort of is listening to the football game over his earbuds, and eventually hears a murder and walks over and actually sees it being committed by Riccardo Cucciola. So the difference between this and a giallo film is this just shows you it all straight up. In something like Bird with the Crystal Plumage or Deep Red, some of those classic gialli, we open with the murder and stuff like that. And it's about putting it together because we don't know who the killer is. It's very much a whodunit. This film kind of starts with that same murder, but rather than kind of keeping it a mystery, this is about sort of like dissecting and unpacking sort of the class and the way that the systems interact with sort of the criminal justice system in Rome and Italy at the time. And I think that stuff is really interesting. And it certainly has takes some very, very interesting slants. I did really like the Horwath essay. One thing that is important is to the interplay of the characters too, is that they show the character, Enzo Caruso, reading sort of the communist paper and sort of getting his news that way. And so he's sort of presented as more of like the leftist type, whereas the Riccardo Cucciola, who plays this more established person that is more used to working the system, and he plays a physics and math teacher who is presumably a little bit more conservative. And so the whole film is basically just based off that central premise and how the system can work in favor of the Cucciola character rather than the Caruso character, just as the more established person, and the way that is biased, even though he is actually the guilty party. So I'm not really spoiling too much by talking about it in that way. This murder happens in the first just few minutes of the film. But yeah, it really, really starts off strong. The editing is very, very good. For the most part, the film is shot very functionally. I'm not going to say this is one of those films with like just eye-popping cinematography or something like that. But the first set piece and stuff like that, it just felt very well organized, very well thought through. So this film was directed and also with a writing credit by Vittorio Salerno, who is not particularly well known. He directed a very early giallo that sort of sits in between that Blood and Black Lace and Bird with the Crystal Plumage, sort of that very unsung period. Libido, which I think is definitely one of the better ones of that era. He co-directed that with Ernesto Gastaldi, who is more known for his writing. And he is probably more well known for having just a very famous brother, who is your third lead of this film, played by who plays the reporter, Enrico Maria Salerno, who I think was they originally wanted him to play the professor, which I think would have made this a really, really interesting movie too. So yeah, he was able to get his brother into this film, and he only has, I think, 8 writing or directing credits, so not a ton of work, but I have been a fan of the few films I have seen by him, and yeah, I think this one is really, really good. Let's see, what else do we have here? So I think a lot of the strength of this film, too, is based off of the strengths of the performances and the way that the actors play off each other. The two leads, Riccardo Cucciola and Enzo Caruso, are both excellent. In particular, Cucciola, I think, is really good. Eurocrime viewers might know him from Rabid Dogs, playing the protagonist there. He's playing like these middle-aged people that kind of have just like a lot going on. You can just see him thinking sort of behind those eyes. And I appreciate that he's willing to take on these roles that are a little bit more edgy. They're pushing the limits a little bit more and playing against type. We have a very kind of mild-mannered, middle-aged looking guy here that plays the murderer in this case. And so I think Cucciola really is quite strong. And the other thing I really wanted to highlight is the scenes between Caruso and Cucciola are really, really good. They're just very good together, including the first one where we see the murder happening, and just the way it's edited is like a standoff. We see them both looking at each other. It's almost a bit like a standoff in a spaghetti western or something like that before a duel. And that's just the opening of the film. Eventually they have basically 1.5 more scenes together. So not a ton of screen time together, but they're all very, very tense, and I think the actors just play very, very well off of each other. So if you were to kind of list sort of the number one strengths of Italian Eurocrime or just genre film in general, I think acting would be pretty low on the list. Usually acting is not necessarily the strong point of these films. Things like the technical aspects, the set pieces, the willing to just go bonkers, stuff like that would probably be higher on the list. But in this case, I think the acting is definitely pretty top notch for an Italian crime film of that of this era. Enrico Maria Salerno, of course, is also very good. He's always really good, definitely one of the stronger actors. So all three of them, particularly Cucciola and Salerno, just have really, they bring a certain gravitas to these roles that just really draws you in. And you can't say the same for all sort of Eurocrime leads of. In other couple things, Riz Ortolani did the score. Again, very solid work, as you can expect. The Italians just absolutely crushed the score. The Rome setting, also very cool. Those things are kind of just the home field advantage of the Italian films industry of the time. And those things are just such an amazing backdrop to have a world-class composer like that. And just like a beautiful city behind. It's just a perfect backdrop, and for me, it's just it's just candy. It's just so easy for me to digest, and such a big reason why even on some of the more mediocre entries, I still have a lot to enjoy, just in the terms of like having this story with the great backdrop and music going on. I think the film is also quite well directed. In the sense that it really does try to get into the heads of the character, particularly Cerusco. And we see how both him and Cucciola react to kind of the initial act of violence that happens. And so it kind of shows just like Cerusco just being very tortured, traumatized, and just being scared. And it's very understandable the way he acts, even though it's obviously he's acting kind of stupid throughout it, which is like kind of important, but he just very much acts guilty because he's afraid of the system and afraid of the police and stuff like that. And you can sort of understand that. In the same sense, I've seen this film compared to Citizen Above Suspicion, which is the Elio Petri film with Gian Maria Vogliante. And to be honest, I actually like this movie more. I'm not a huge fan of Citizen Above Suspicion. It's a film I've seen a few times, and it's just not for me, I think. Petri, of course, is a really, really good director. Gian Maria Vogliante, also a really good actor. But for me, something about that film is I find to be more irritating than effective. So I don't know what it is, but I do actually like this film a little bit more. So I know that's a little bit of a minoritarian view. That is the one that has gotten the Criterion treatment, and this is the one that gets packaged with a bunch of other films into a Blu-ray set. But personally, I'd much rather watch this film again, too. Another thing I like, it really does kind of focus and think through a lot of the procedural elements. I believe this is based off a book, so I wonder if some of this elements is coming from that. It just has a lot of like details that feel like they're a little bit more thought through rather than being more paper thin like some of these can be. So details sort of like a jolly. There's even a moment in this film where the Salerno character basically writes in his story that this story could be used as inspiration for a movie, or a TV movie, which I think is kind of funny because so many of these Eurocrime films of the time were basically using real life as inspiration or headlines straight from the paper. So it's interesting that it sort of has that like self-awareness, so to speak, where it's like all these different films and this creator content is just being created from like these headlines. Last thing I wanted to mention is the ending is laughably tacked on. It reminds me a lot of those Hong Kong film endings where they would do like 4 or 5 different endings. They'd film them all, and they would potentially release different ones for each audience. They're like, okay, in this country, in Malaysia or whatever, we need to make sure the bad guys are apprehended. And in this film, the ending just is just like 30 seconds that is just totally such a shift. Does not work at all. I kind of like it in just sort of a tacky way, but it is like laughably bad in the way that is just added on to the film. If you've seen the film, you know exactly what I'm talking about, I'm sure. Okay, so who won the movie? As much as I like just sort of this story construction and stuff like that, I think this film is really driven by the actors. In particular, I think my favorite of the film, Ricardo Cucciolo. Salerno is good, but he's in this much less, and I think Cucciolo just has that presence that does draw your eyeballs to it in a way that Cerusco doesn't. So I think that's probably the most compelling performance, just sort of like this very tortured, violent, but kind of like in the body of sort of like this almost like more academic scholar type. So I think that part is just really, really well done. So good job by Cucciolo in this film. Rating, gonna give this a 7.5 out of 10. Just really, really solid film. Absolutely recommend it. If you have been holding off on watching this because it sounds a little bit more boring than the rest of the Arrow box set, don't. Please. This film is potentially my favorite of the set. Probably right up there with Highway Racer as being my absolute two favorites of this. So thank you for Arrow for releasing this. I'm just glad to see a lot of these sort of unsung gems getting more just a little bit more playtime. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Let me know how you like this video. Give it a thumbs up if you did, and hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see more. I'll see you all next time.